All right. Can everyone see the screen here? We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Business Bite. SIMBA hosts this every second Monday of the month on a different topic for 30 minutes. So you can join us with your lunch and you can go ahead and learn about something relevant to your business or nonprofit. And one of the questions we receive all the time is about starting a nonprofit in Washington State. And yes, we're going to talk about the steps to start a nonprofit in Washington State, but we're really going to talk about today is kind of the theory of whether or not you should, or like an analysis you should take about whether or not you should start a nonprofit in Washington State and some things to be aware of. As always, we are able to offer these presentations as part of our work with the Department of Commerce's Small Business Resiliency Network. Let's save questions till the end because when I run presentations on Canva, I can't actually see the Zoom meeting anymore. So we'll save questions to the end and we'll just go from there. So what is a nonprofit? A nonprofit is simply a tax designation. A nonprofit is either a corporation or sometimes an LLC that's exempt from federal income taxes. It's nothing else. It's not any separate kind of business, just as compared to a for-profit. It doesn't make you exempt from payroll taxes if you have employees, both federal and state, depending on what state you're in. It doesn't make you exempt from retail sales taxes. So if you sell stickers or t-shirts or tickets to an event, you have to pay those retail sales taxes to Washington. And if you earn enough income, you have to pay business and occupancy taxes in Washington State as well, which is Washington State's business tax. It applies to for-profit and nonprofit businesses. So the only tax you're exempt from is federal income tax. It also doesn't mean that the entity doesn't make money or that you can't retain earnings from year to year. It just means that you don't share profits like you would as the owner of an LLC or a corporation or any other kind of business. Technically, there are no owners of a nonprofit. The board of directors, which we'll talk about in a minute, are the folks who are legally and financially responsible for the organization, but they are not owners of the business. In addition, executive directors, I'm the executive director here at SIMBA, are also not owners of the business. Technically, no one owns a nonprofit, unlike a corporation or an LLC. Because nonprofits receive funds, either donations or grants or contracts, that goes in support of their mission. They serve as public charities or private foundations to hold that money for specific purposes. So they're not owners in the sense because owners are entitled to share in earnings. For a nonprofit, all those earnings go into reserves and or directly into programming as directed by funders, donors, and your mission. Again, you don't split the funds at the end of the year if you have a good year like you would at a for-profit entity. So what's required? And this is a really quick overview, and you can definitely consult with us if you have questions about what that might look like. But I'm going to try to make this, nope. Okay. I was going to try to make this full screen, but it's not letting me. Here's kind of a quick overview. There are two ways to start a nonprofit. One is by filing with the IRS first and then filing with your state. I think it's a lot easier to file with your state first. It gives you time to decide if a nonprofit structure is right for you. It gives you time to test things out, raise money, start applying for grants and those kinds of things without having to take the IRS step. So in Washington State, that looks like this. And again, these rules are going to vary state by state, but this is for Washington. So the first thing is to form a Washington State nonprofit corporation with the Secretary of State. That's where you file or form any formal entity. So an LLC, a formal partnership, a trust, a corporation, nonprofit corporation, you form them with the Secretary of State. You need at least 3 board members at all times, a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. Some of those roles can be combined. You could have a secretary treasurer, but the president role can't be combined with the others. And again, you have to have at least 3 board members at all times to run a Washington State nonprofit. You can have more, but you cannot have less. And you must renew your corporate status annually with the Secretary of State to maintain your entity. And that is true of any formal entity. You file once to start it, and then you file an annual report every year to keep your entity. If you don't do that, you can lose your entity status, which could have some pretty serious consequences for both your for-profit or nonprofit business. Next, you need to adopt nonprofit bylaws. Nonprofit bylaws direct officer or director terms, how long you serve. Are you serving for a year? Are you serving for 3 years? How many terms you can have? Can you serve indefinitely? Do you have to stagger your terms? All those kinds of things. How frequently you conduct meetings. You have to have a meeting at least once a year. And by what means you conduct those meetings. So do you have to meet in person? Can you meet on Zoom? Can you meet on the phone? And what happens if you decide to close your nonprofit? And for nonprofits that seek tax exempt status from the IRS, if you close your nonprofit, all of your assets, so all of your money, your equipment, anything you own has to be distributed to another nonprofit that has exempt status. You cannot split it among yourselves. It cannot go to your staff. It cannot go to your board. It cannot go to a for-profit entity. You need to obtain a Washington State business license, and you need to maintain it annually. In the city of Spokane and Spokane County, a nonprofit business license is about $70 a year. You need that for your nonprofit, whether you're making or collecting money or not. You need to register for Washington State charitable solicitation and maintain that filing. That is through the Secretary of State. That allows you to ask for donations. If you don't register for charitable solicitations, your entity can be barred from receiving donations. And you personally, as the person collecting donations, can be barred from soliciting donations for that entity or any other entity. The reason really for charitable solicitation registration is because there are a lot of people who are professional fundraisers, and they have to disclose who they're raising funds for and where the funds are going. The goal is to protect the public. So you have to do that as well. And again, that's at the Secretary of State. You need to then, when you're ready, apply for and maintain exempt status from the IRS. There are 2 forms to do it. One is the longer form if you've made more than $50,000 in a year or anticipate making more than $50,000. And then one if you made less than $50,000 a year and anticipate making less than 50. You have 27 months from the day you start your Washington State nonprofit to file for exempt status, or you could be subject to corporate 23% federal taxes. So make sure you are starting that clock. But you have 27 months to decide if you are ready to do this or not. You'll also file state taxes. Whether you pay them or not is up in the air. You don't pay taxes on donations. You do pay taxes on most grants. And you need to file your federal taxes. Again, you won't pay federal income taxes. That's called a Form 990. There's 2 different forms. One if you make more than $50,000 and one if you make less than $50,000. Failure to file your 990 can automatically revoke your nonprofit status, which means you become a for-profit corporation and you and your board are subject to taxes. You need to have those meetings as directed by your bylaws. If your bylaws say you need to have 10 meetings a year, you have to have 10 meetings a year. You need to provide appropriate notice, and your bylaws should explain what that notice is. Is it an email? Is it an annual calendar? Do you have to do it in writing? And you have to keep meeting minutes. Meeting minutes for all board meetings for nonprofits have to be kept for the entire duration of the nonprofit. So forever. If you've been around since the 80s, you should have a lot of meeting minutes. You need to adopt an annual budget. Again, a budget is an estimate of how much you're going to earn or spend, but you need to adopt an annual budget. And you need to understand and track restricted versus unrestricted funds, both donations and grants or contracts. Generally speaking, most orgs seek unrestricted funds, and you say donate now. But if you want to donate to a specific project, say you want to donate to a scholarship fund for high school students, and you have a donate link for a scholarship fund for high school students, you cannot use those funds for anything other than the scholarship for high school students. There's a process to change funds from restricted to unrestricted, but you need to be able to track those. But what are the real things you should think about if you're going to start a nonprofit? Those are the steps, and there are a lot of them, but what should you actually be considering, whether you're starting a nonprofit or not? The first is there a need? What is the purpose you're trying to serve? Are there existing nonprofits, for-profits, or other resources in your community already addressing these issues? So, for example, domestic violence. There are a number of domestic violence organizations in the Spokane area. So, there's always a need to support victims of domestic violence. But is there already someone doing it? Should you just work for that organization? Should you offer a program for that organization? Should you donate to that organization or volunteer for them instead of starting another nonprofit that's going to compete for the resources that are already going to the nonprofits doing that work? Are you the right person or group of people to start this nonprofit? So certain kinds of funding, for example, for grants is what we call by and for funding, meaning the people who are running the organization, either your board or your executive staff, if you have staff, need to be from the communities you're trying to serve. So if you are serving rural small business owners, you should have someone on your board and or your leadership who has some experience serving rural small businesses, either as a rural community member or a rural citizen or has done the work in the community. If you are trying to serve immigrant populations, you should consider whether or not you are trying to whether or not there are immigrants on your board. So are you the right people to start this? If you're starting something, let's say tutoring for after-school students, do you have experience in tutoring students after school? Are you the right person to be running this organization? Are there enough volunteers to sustain this before you can hire staff? There's not startup funding for nonprofits, which I'll talk about in a moment. So do you have enough people to do the work for free to sustain the work before you can earn the funds to hire staff? And volunteers include both your board and others who might be running your program. And as an aside, board members are never paid at nonprofits. It's actually illegal for them to be paid. They can be reimbursed for reasonable expenses, like let's say they needed mileage for a meeting or they bought treats for a program. If you have a policy that allows reimbursements, you can reimburse them, but they are not paid. And until you have sustainable funding, you can't pay staff. So do you have enough volunteers to run this and do this work? How are you going to be funded? And is my funding model sustainable? This is the most important thing to consider. There is almost no such thing as startup funding in the form of grants or contracts for nonprofits. You need to find community support, literally donor dollars, to start this. Most nonprofits start with a small amount of donor dollars and a large amount of volunteer work. Sometimes you're lucky and you get a large donation initially, but you cannot rely on grants or contracts to start up. Most grant funding is for existing nonprofits. Some grant funding isn't even permissible for nonprofits until they can sustain themselves. So a lot of funding from bigger foundations, the bigger grants, are for nonprofits that already exist, are already doing good work in community, and the foundations want to keep them funded. So you need to think of a startup funding model. And if you think I'm going to apply for grants to get startup funding, you're not ready to start a nonprofit yet. This is one specific for staff. Do you want a volunteer board to oversee your work? So I'm the executive director at SIMBA. I'm evaluated by our board as a single body, and they set my wages. That is true for every executive director at a nonprofit. And your board volunteers can be engaged or not engaged. It's always going to vary nonprofit to nonprofit. But you, as the director of the organization, like the CEO of the organization, are evaluated, like your personnel evaluation, and your wages are set by a board. You may have some say in what your income is. You're definitely participating in helping fund a budget, but you are not setting your wages. The executive director, though, does play a part in setting the wages of staff, but only within the approved budget of the board. So the board can set a budget that the executive director should follow for staffing. So yes, in a way, the board is directing staff wages as well. So be aware that you're not just setting your own wages like you would if you owned a for-profit business. Who's going to manage compliance? There's a lot of compliance for nonprofits. As I mentioned already, if you fail to file your 990, that federal tax return, you can lose your tax exempt status and potentially subject your board and your assets to federal corporate taxes. There's a lot of record keeping required. As I mentioned, you have to keep your meeting minutes forever. You have to keep your bylaws forever and all iterations of them. You need to have conflict of interest policies. You need to have human resources policies if you're managing staff. So who's going to manage that? Particularly if you're someone who's good at the grassroots or ideas phase, you need someone else on your team who can do those things. Who's going to manage your finances and file your taxes? Again, your 990s, your excise taxes, which are your Washington state taxes. Again, you'll definitely have to file them. You may not have to pay them. Your statement of activity, which is what we call profit and loss for a nonprofit. It's the same form, but because we don't have profits at a nonprofit, it's called a statement of activity. Who's going to help put together your budget and approve that budget? You need someone to do those things as well. Who will write grants and make financial asks? Grant writing is an art and a science. Their grants applications can be long. They can be tedious. Some of them can be pretty short. Those are for smaller grants. They're going to ask you a lot of both data, numbers, and they're going to ask narrative questions. So data questions are going to be like, if you receive this $100,000 grant, how many people are you going to serve with this grant? So let's say you run a food bank and you ask for $100,000. How many families are you going to feed? How many pounds of food will you be able to distribute with this funding? Narrative portion is what is going to be the impact in words of what you're going to do with this grant funding. Making financial asks is asking for donations or corporate sponsorships or corporate partnerships or large corporate donations. Who on your team is able to make that ask? And importantly for your board, are there folks who are going to be on your team who have connections to potentially large donors or consistent donors, which is just as important as small donors, as large donors? Who knows someone at a bank who might fund your work? Who can navigate a sponsorship agreement? Who's going to manage your grants and contracts? Grant writers and grant compliance folks are not necessarily the same people. At SIMBA, it's the same person, it's me. But at a lot of orgs, it's not the same person because it is kind of two different skill sets. So managing grants is tracking the data that funder wants you to provide for your grant report or your contract report. A lot of grants don't pay you until your report is done, or they only pay you partially until your report is done. All Washington state contracts and all federal contracts are reimbursable, meaning you do the work, you submit a report, and then you get paid. So you need someone who can manage the data and do the narrative writing for the grants and contracts so you get paid. Grants and contracts can be terminated and you don't get paid for failure to manage that. So who on your team has those analysis skills and what tools are you going to have? Is it spreadsheets? Is it a CRM, a customer relations management software? Is it something else that you're going to be able to track all that data? And it is going to vary by funder. We manage a large data set at SIMBA here, and every funder wants something different. Who will actually do the programming? When you start up, it's probably going to be your board, but maybe you're lucky and you have some volunteers who can do the programming for you. So again, we'll use the food bank example. So if you're a food bank, you need someone to collect donations, to process donations, to package donations, and to distribute them. Who's actually going to do that work? And can you do it sustainably? Who's going to manage your volunteers to make sure they show up on time, to make sure they have all the tools they need to do their work, to track their hours, because you need to track volunteer hours as a nonprofit and report them on your tax forms? Who's going to do donor engagement for you? So maybe you have someone who's going to make the asks for that money, which is beyond just putting a donation link on your website, but who's going to follow up and send thank you cards? Who's going to call and ask for a future donation? Who is going to arrange for a donor lunch or a donor appreciation event? Again, potentially different skill sets. When you're starting out, a lot of you are going to have overlapping roles, but you need to think about these things before you form your nonprofits, because these are all the things that a successful nonprofit has. So some resources. SIMBA's video library is free and on demand. Most of them are for-profit videos. Some of them are geared towards nonprofits. We continue to grow our video series. This one will be online for you. We offer free and low-cost consultations and memberships. We have a nonprofit-specific membership now, only available to nonprofits. It includes grant searches, consultations, and some other services as well that are for-profit members don't necessarily receive because you need different things. Mark Pond and Startup Spokane, if you're a resident of the city of Spokane, you can use Startup Spokane's resources. Mark Pond is the business librarian and an OG SIMBA board member. They have a pretty great grant search platform there that you can use for free with a Spokane library card. We offer workshops and events. They are on our events calendar. We also highlight our SIMBA member events. So if you're one of our members and you're having an event, you can post it to SIMBA's website for free. We always have at least one Zoom and usually one in-person event. We do give away some free consultations at those workshops and events. Live Local is our flagship independent and local Eastern Washington business and nonprofit directory. It is free to be on there. You only have to receive our newsletter. You don't have to read it, although you should, especially if you're looking to form a nonprofit, because we have business tips on there in the form of compliance information, as well as information about available grants for Eastern Washington for-profit and nonprofit businesses. I highly recommend, before you consider starting a nonprofit, that you read closely the Washington State Nonprofit Handbook. It is a very good resource. The most recent version is the 2022 version that is linked here. After all of our workshops, we share these slides out. These are all live links to take you exactly where you need to go. It will walk you through all kinds of tools. It's like a workbook and information to tell you what you need to do before you start it. And then NAWA, the Washington Association of Nonprofits, has a nonprofit series of videos for considerations. Questions? I'm going to stop sharing. Daria, do you have questions?
I have a question.
Please, Alexis.
I see like a ton of... Oh, Daria, you can go if you're ready.
Yeah. Hi, I'm listening. We're really in this, as you all know, like in this really interesting transition phase where we're trying to figure out how the creative districts can get out from its current fiscal sponsorship with a municipal entity and really be structured appropriately to sign a lease and run services and access points for the community. So I've been all over your website and your services figuring out like what would a transfer under SIMBA fiscal sponsorship look like for us as an incubator to keep doing the good work we're doing, but without having to think about all of the accounting components and compliance components. But we have money, so that's the interesting thing. The PDA is willing to fund us up front because we're performing the economic development duties that they're supposed to perform. So and then we have the tax increment. So we're not missing out on the funding part. It's the infrastructure and not wanting to overhire the team if there are things that we can do with SIMBA.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Maybe a specific meeting when you're back in town. But that's a good question related to starting that nonprofit, as I talked about at the beginning. It takes a while to get your tax exempt status, and maybe you're not ready to have your own tax exempt status. So one way to get around that is fiscal sponsorship. There are different models of fiscal sponsorship. The most common are a type A and type C. I do not know why there's not a type B. I didn't set up the system. But type A is the really comprehensive fiscal sponsorship where they're managing your accounting. They may be managing your payroll. They may be signing your leases, kind of very all-encompassing. Usually costs a little more, obviously, because they're doing more. The other model is type C, where they're just kind of a pass-through for funding. So you can receive funds while you're in the process of applying for your own status, but you're managing your own kind of day-to-day work. So SIMBA does, thanks for the lead-in, Daria. SIMBA does offer fiscal sponsorship, and you can book a consultation with me at no charge to talk about what that looks like and what might be available to you. If you're ready to get started on that journey. And we offer a variety of fiscal sponsorship models. We're really trying to make them accessible for what people need, because folks need different kinds of things. So type A and type C are the most common models. There are other fiscal sponsors available nationwide, and I always try to refer folks to definitely talk to us and talk to everyone else because you need to have a good fit for that. So that's a great question, Daria, and I look forward to meeting with you when you're back in town. Alexis, what is your question?
My question was, I get a lot of confusion about people who are like founders. They're trying to start this nonprofit, and they eventually want to move into like a staff executive director role and get paid for their work. But sometimes starting out, there isn't the funds to do that, of like having an employee or stuff like that. What is there like any way they should go about it? Any rules of like becoming like, should they join the board first and then become a staff, or like how, but then also
Yeah.
should they be
So
independent contractors, stuff like that?
yeah, so it's going to depend on what your funding source is, because one thing to consider is if you're hiring an employee, you need to pay them reasonable wages. Um, what's reasonable varies, but it's at least minimum wage, if not more. And you also need to be able to sustain that, right? So often it's independent contractor, but if it's an independent contractor, you need to truly treat them as an independent contractor, meaning you need to have a contract with them. You need to have that executive director invoice. So I know for SIMBA, our founder became our ED. She was on the board for a little bit. Then we received a large donation that allowed us to hire her as a contractor, but she had to send invoices. Um, the board could direct what she wanted to get done, and she only did that work and didn't do anything else versus a lot of executive directors, especially at small orgs, kind of do everything. So you need to be prepared for that. And if you want someone who's going to do everything, you need to pay them better, is the other consideration. And if you don't have consistent funding and you hire someone and then you run out of funds to pay them, your board could be individually liable to pay them. So it's often better to have them as a contractor. I think if you're the founder, you need to be ready to spend quite a bit of time volunteering. And you also need to know that the board gets to decide who their executive director is. And just because you found an organization doesn't mean you're going to be the director. And the board has the ability to hire or fire the executive director. That's the only staff person they have the ability to hire or fire. So you also need to be aware that you are not necessarily going to be the one who's hired to do the work. You may be hired in a different role. Maybe your expertise is not in executive director work. And I see this a lot with founders. A lot of founders are visionaries and dreamers and very thoughtful, which is very important work. Someone needs to decide where the org is going to go and what they should be doing. But the executive director role is a lot of compliance, and it's a lot of record keeping and data. So if you are not, and financial knowledge. So if you're not that person, being the executive director is maybe not the right role for you, especially if you can't hire a large enough team where you can have different folks in that space.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks for your questions. We will share these slides. Daria, I will reach out to you so we can get on calendars for when you're back in town and talk about that option. And then, as always, Business Bites is the second Monday of the month on a different topic. And if you missed out, you'll still get the slides and you'll still get the recorded presentation. And this will be up on our YouTube soon. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.